Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of It's Not That Simple from the Francisco Manuel dos Santos Foundation. Great to have you there. It should be a fantastic episode because today we're going to be joined by Esther Duflo, a well-renowned international economist, Abdul Latif Jamil Professor of Economics at MIT, also co-founder and co-director of JPAL, that's the poverty lab that she started as well, president of the Paris School of Economics. She won a variety of awards as well, most notably the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, along Abhijit Banerjee and Michael Kramer. She's done a lot of work around alleviating global poverty, and that is obviously going to be the topic of today's discussion. So Esther, first of all, thank you so much for finding the time to join us. I know you're a very busy woman. I'd like to set the scene for our viewers, for our listeners, and define what poverty is in your eyes, and also explain why it's really not simple to deal with.
Well, the key is to remember that poverty is multidimensional. It's not just one thing. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as people who live under roughly $2 a day, accounting for differences in purchasing power. So you have to imagine yourself living in Lisbon for $2 a day per person. You can already see how difficult that would be. But it's not just about money. Poverty is also about the lack of a good education, the lack of access to decent healthcare, the inability, for example, for women to work when they want to, or maybe most generally for people to fully realize what they might want or are able to be by virtue of lack of resources or the accident of their birth.
You know, what I find incredibly interesting, and obviously I'm not the only one about the work that you've done and the research that you've done, is that you really have shown the importance of thinking small when it comes to poverty, not as far as the small impact, but the small actions. So would you share that vision with us?
Yeah, so the moment that you start defining poverty this way, it kind of pretty naturally leads to this way of thinking in terms of relatively a specific intervention. So you could call them small intervention, but their effect might be in fact big on people's lives. Because in the same way that poverty is multidimensional, the problems that affect poor people are multiple and multidimensional as well. And therefore, you could be tempted that, this is such a big problem, I'm going to find a miracle solution that's going to erase the entire problem at once. And it would be great, but such solution really does not exist. What is much more productive is to say, being poor leads to a myriad of problems. And a myriad of problems call for a myriad of solutions. So instead of getting despair that you cannot solve the entire problems at once, and go problem by problem, solution by solution. And the advantage of specific problems is that they call for specific solution that you can design, you can test, you can investigate. And in this way, you can make real progress.
It's interesting because what I've seen in other interviews that you've given is you've also explained a little bit the mentality you need to have when dealing with poverty, and that can be a little bit like a plumber, right? You actually need to get in there and solve it on a day-to-day basis. And when you talk about having $2 a day to live on, that is literally nothing. So when you try to apply your models to fix this issue, what do you think is the most important thing that politicians need to have in their head?
I think the most important thing that politicians, but also researchers and even activists need to have in their head is that you need to be constantly humble. Because with all of these issues that we have to deal with, we don't have the answers a priori. No theory of human being or human behavior or society can really give us the answer. The best you can do, and that's where the plumber mentality comes in, is, okay, I'm going to put my best foot forward. I'm going to try something out. It might or it might not work. Very much like when a plumber comes to your house and they can't see the whole thing. Part of it is hidden under the sink in the walls and so on. So they say, okay, let me try this. And then maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. And then if it doesn't work, they don't, say, oh, well, if it doesn't work in practice, it must be that practice is wrong because my theory is right. What they do is they say, okay, fine, let's try something else until they get to the solution that solves the issue. And in the process, also probably understand the root cause of the issue. That's really like the approach that we are trying to have. That is at the same time very, very pragmatic and also nourished by a desire to understand the lives of the poor in order to come up with other ideas and other solutions down the line, but always being guided and being chastised when needed by reality and facts. And I think that's the key thing that all of us can learn.
Are politicians learning this, Esther, and are they prioritizing poverty the way they should?
So these are really two different questions. Whether or not politicians are prioritizing poverty, it depends a little bit on their political leanings, which itself reflects maybe the sort of the will of the people, at least in democracies. And in some sense, as an expert, I have nothing to say about that. Personally, as a citizen and as a human being, I very much think that they should prioritize poverty. But this is a little bit certainly beyond my remit as an expert. Then there is the next question, which is, given your priority, what's the best way to get there? So if a politician's priority is poverty, or even within poverty, if a politician's priority, for example, is to improve the quality of education or the number of kids who get immunized, then that's when I can come in, or not just me, but all of the researchers and the technicians, and say, well, what's the best way to get there? You want to achieve that. There are multiple things you could try. What do we already know? What are the area of uncertainty? What you could try and how you could test whether or not this attempt works.
Going back to the work that led you to winning the Nobel Prize in 2019, much of it was focused in around India and Kenya. Regarding everything and all the data that you were able to compile at the time, how was it and continues to be pertinent to solving these issues in other geographies such as Europe?
So a lot of my work tends to be on India and then other countries in the global south, like Kenya or Ghana. I've also done some work on Morocco and so on. But if you take the entire network, JPAL that you mentioned, the Jamil Poverty Action Lab, that's 1,000 researchers working in all of the geographies of the world, including richer countries like Europe or also the US and Canada. So really the philosophy that you need to try things out and then you need to test things, that applies regardless of geography. And the researchers in our network work everywhere. In particular, there is actually a lot of work in Europe. Neighboring Spain has launched into a huge effort lately to test out the impact of a new array of social policy measures. Then there is a question of whether some of the insight apply when the contexts are very different. And the truth is that some do, some don't, because some things might have universal applicability and others, as lessons, are very dependent on the context. For example, how much resources is available.
I think when it comes to Europe, obviously I'm sure it's incomparable to other areas of the world. You mentioned in India, Kenya, Ghana, but from your studies and the data as well, Esther, what do you think are the main causes of poverty in Europe that differ from other areas of the planet, and the maybe increase in inequality that we see?
So I always find it very difficult to think about the causes of poverty or like the causes of anything really, because those are kind of multiple and intersects. And so to me, it's much easier to think about the impact of something than about the cause of something. It's much easier to think of the effect of something than the cause of something. So that's one way in which I'm not going to exactly answer your question. And the other way is that let me try with some commonalities, perhaps, which is something that you find that is common in almost all countries, is a deep mistrust of the poor by the people who are not so poor. And in particular, by policymakers, and even in the way that it's often reflected in the laws or in the systems. There is this idea that's pretty deeply rooted in a lot of our systems that the poor tend to be lazy, and that maybe that's why they're poor. And if we are too generous with them, then we might make them more lazy. So you can even go to an argument where it's like it's really wouldn't be doing them a favor to help them too much, because it would help them go into further dig themselves deeper into this poverty. And this is something you're finding in Europe. For example, in France, there is a big kind of attempt to find out who might be cheating on the receipt of the minimum protection income, and that you find also in poor countries, for example, with very complicated rules to access social programs to make sure that nobody who is not eligible really gets it. And I think something that is common, again, to rich and poor countries is that when the rules are a little bit more generous and a little bit less complex, you get people who really should benefit from these services, who get to access them, without getting much, people who are ineligible, or without making people lazy. For example, when people get kind of a stability income, like a sure income, regardless of their work, that doesn't stop them from working. And now I'm coming to your question on differences. I think a big difference between rich and poor countries is that the richer countries have much more developed social protection measures, avoiding the very desperate situation where people literally have no food to put on the table. And that is something that poor countries don't have, partly because they don't have the resources to do it, partly because this is not the way that their social distribution system were designed or thought about.
I think the issue of poverty also is so impactful when it comes to its relationship with education and health. Whereas poor education obviously can lead to poverty, health is very much a result of the poverty, right? Tell us about the dynamic between these three elements that, of course, are key to having a healthy society. And here I'm talking about not only from a physical perspective, but from a mental perspective and an economic perspective.
So what's very interesting is that all three are really related to all three in bi-directional way. So, for example, in Kenya, one of the first randomized control trials was an experiment by Michael Kremer and Ted Miguel on deworming that showed that a very simple treatment that costs 50 cents a child a year can help kids dealing with their intestinal worms, and therefore mean that they miss fewer days of school, they learn more in school. And when they're grown up, because they've been able to follow now these kids for many years after, they're still following them up. When they grow up, they are healthier and they work more and they make more money. So you can see how something very unlikely, which is this like very simple treatment, which is a health treatment, has implication for education and for income, both directly and via the education channel. Conversely, when people are very get a big health shocks, that is the one thing which in poorer countries and actually also in richer countries has catastrophic impact sometimes on their economic status, because they can't face the bills and they go into debt in order to pay for the bill and so on. This is like the one big shock that really can put people, can set people back, sometimes for generations. And that's, again, more likely in poorer countries because richer countries have better protection against those economic impact of health shock. Conversely, when people are not in good health, they work less, they are less productive. And so there are this interrelationship that plays out. And those exist to a certain extent in richer countries, but they are starker in poorer countries, again, because there is no protection from the systems, also because a lot of the work is physical and require strength and good health to be performed.
You mentioned that obviously in richer countries, and Europe is an example of that, there are more social programs, there's more security for the poor generally, and historically that has been true. But have you noticed a shift maybe in that tendency where the welfare state is failing the poor more and more, even in richer countries like Europe? And what impact has migration maybe had in this to a lot of the European states that have had to accommodate big populations of international and foreign people?
So let's start with your descriptive question. I actually think that in terms of the protection that exists, maybe things have improved in the world, in richer countries, because they have improved in the US. The US didn't have any really health insurance system that was covering everyone, and Obamacare changed that in pretty significant way. In Europe, I would say that our ability to protect the health of our citizens is remarkably good when you compare it to the US today or to the rest of the world. So there is tension and there is discussions around it, but we should kind of pause and reflect that we are pretty lucky with the system we have, and we should really do our best to preserve it. Now, let me go to the question of migrants, because that's a pretty fraught political question. So that's a pretty frequent argument that migrants are putting pressure on the health system. But in fact, all the studies show that, if anything, migrants bring a bit more money to the social protection writ large than they cost. So of course they have things that they need, so they are paid by the system, and they also think that they bring because they are young and they work, and through their work they're bringing social security contribution. And on balance, either it evens out, or in some countries it's the migrants bring up a bit more money than they take. In particular, migrants tend to be young and more likely to work. So on the one hand, there's more family expenditure from the social system. On the other hand, they are the ones paying for the pensions of the elderly people, a native population. So the conclusion from the OECD is that they tend to be a net positive. And as our population age more and more and more, the migrant population will become more and more positive from a budget situation. In fact, they will become pretty critical to the financial health of the social protection system, including pension and retirement funds.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it was going to be a follow-up question regarding what we've seen here in Portugal, where actually migrants have made a very positive contribution, mostly through social security. So they can actually be, like you mentioned, the net positive and a positive influence, rather than many times the perception that can be out there due to certain political agendas that migrants are negative, have a negative effect in a society. I wanted to talk a little bit about inequality as well, and its relation to poverty. What have you noticed, let's say, over the last decade or so, regarding inequality between the have and the have-nots? I mean, have you seen an increase in this? Is it possible for the middle class to survive in Europe, focusing specifically in this geographical area?
So the work of the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics has shown that the inequalities have been rising in the world and in almost every single region of the world dramatically, not only in the last decade, but in the last several decades. In particular, Europe, that used to be remarkably equal, again, compared to either the US or to most of the developing world, is becoming unequal. It's still less unequal than the US, less dramatically unequal, but inequality really increased very fast. For example, the richest person in the world is today a French person. That's kind of a good symbol of the fact that inequalities is also a big issue in Europe today. And I think you're right to point out the middle class, because what has been going on again over the last several decades is, on the one hand, remarkable progress for the extreme poor around the world, where the rate in the last 30 years, the rate of people who live in extreme poverty has been divided by 2. On the other hand, so this is as countries like China, like India, but also part of Africa started finally growing and taking out people out of extreme poverty. That's, of course, wonderful news. And also, when people are very, very poor, it doesn't take much to take them just above the poverty line. At the other extreme, the very richest have captured a huge fraction of global growth. And then a big part of the world, and that's really from the middle classes in Europe up to a pretty high level in the income distribution, have been completely squished in this process, with income staying mostly flat in real terms, with standard of living not really improving, perceived standard of living certainly not improving, especially after a previous period that was a period of general improvement in quality of life. So for the European citizens of middle class, from the poor to the middle class, it's really been a very, very difficult time.
For sure. I mean, and something that I believe makes it clear as well that inequality continues to rise is we've never had as many billionaires as we have on the planet today, right? Which is absolutely insane. We saw that during COVID as well, being intensified. As we look at what can be in store for the planet over the next decades, Esther, I think it'd be a mistake for me not to mention climate change, global warming, and how that can affect populations moving and what that does to different sections of the world, right? So I know it's obviously a very complex topic, but in general terms, what can be the impact of global warming in the dynamics of poverty of different regions on the planet, in your opinion?
So, in fact, it's reasonably simple in the big scheme of things, and then, of course, in the solution, it gets to the detailed of the murkiness of each solution. But the statement of the problem is the following: number one, most of the emissions that are responsible for climate change are due to the behavior of the richest citizen in the world, and in particular of rich citizens in rich countries. Lucas Chancel summarizes it very nicely, saying that the 10% biggest emitter are responsible for 50% of total emissions, and conversely, the 50% lowest are responsible for only 10%. That means that it is really a huge inequality in emissions around the world. The responsibility of climate change is related to this increase in inequality, and in particular in the rise of billionaires and multimillionaires, perhaps. On the other hand, while everyone will suffer from the consequence of climate change, the first victims, the most important victims, will be poor people in poor countries. Why? Because poor countries are in places that's already hot. And so as the planet warms, the effects are not going to be the same in Sweden, where it's very cold and a little bit warmer is going to be, pleasant, and in Namibia or in Niger, which are in a place that's already extremely hot and extremely dry and a desert. So overall, there is going to be a large mortality increase related to this highest temperature And this increase is going to be entirely focused outside of the richer countries, outside of the OECD. And this increase is going to be so large, there's going to be millions of people every year. About 6 to 7 million of people will die just because of higher temperature by 2100. This is more than the number of people who die of all infectious diseases combined every year today. So on the one hand, the problem is caused by the behavior mostly of rich citizens, most of whom are in rich countries. There are some in poor countries as well. And on the other hand, the consequences are very stark. They're really life and death, mostly in the poor countries. So that is a pretty big problem. That is a pretty big problem because the solutions really rest mainly in rich countries. We have to change the way we behave. We have to change the way we consume. We have to change, what's important and not. But the impact is going to be in poor countries, and we are not very good at defining problems in this global way. Why would I change my behavior because of the life of a little girl in the Sahel? Well, because she's a human, and so.
Yeah, and again, that comes back to, we talked about education before, but there's an education of humanity that many times I think personally is missing in the affluent countries and in the affluent societies of the empathy towards those less fortunate, which, in my opinion, during my lifetime has certainly reduced. Anyway, again, that's a topic for another conversation. Time is running out. Before I ask you a series of quick fire questions that we ask all our guests, I do have a question here that I think is extremely valuable for our viewers, for our listeners, which is taking into account all the data that you've gathered, all the experience you've had, working with governments as well. What's the best piece of advice that you can give a politician that would give you a call now and say, Esther, I want to solve this. I want to really get to the bottom of poverty in my country, in my region, in my continent. What do I need to do? Help me. What would you say?
So maybe I would start with, trust the poor, respect their judgment, and respect the poor, give them the dignity that they have and that they deserve and that they want. And as the guiding principle, it goes a long way. It kind of eliminates many things that politicians would naturally do, and it brings in many things that they would not necessarily think about. That would be my first piece of advice. And my second piece of advice is whatever you do, give yourself some space to rigorously evaluate it, because most likely the first thing you try is not going to have the effect that you expect, but you can improve upon it. So you're going to really save a lot of time if you give yourself the time for experimentation. I think with these two principles in hand, we could do so much better than we are doing today with respect to policies that help the poor. And these are the two aspects by which I also try to lead my life and my work.
That was pretty clear. Thank you for that, Esther. So, quick fire questions. In one word or one sentence, I'd like you to try to answer these questions. The first is, what is one personality trait that a good leader could benefit from having?
I need to be a good listener.
Yeah, that shows up a lot. Humility and being able to listen to others is obviously very valuable. What is the biggest challenge that humanity is facing now?
Climate change, without doubt.
If you could change one thing in the world and in the way people act, what would it be?
You mentioned that I would give empathy. I would try and teach empathy to people, to try to put yourself into other people's shoes and see things from their perspective.
And finally, what is the most important learning of your life?
That most of our intuitions are incorrect, and we can fix them by confronting them to the real world.
Wow. Esther, look, I think the work you do is so valuable for the planet. It's been so insightful having an opportunity to learn from you during this conversation. I wish you continued success in all your your work and research and advice and books, which you've written many of and will surely continue to do so. It's been a great pleasure having you on It's Not That Simple.
It was delightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Esther. Definitely such a relevant, a pertinent conversation to have during these times of change, during these times of big decisions around the world when it comes to politics as well. Thank you for being there, for listening, for watching another episode of It's Not That Simple. See you soon.